Okay. Raise your hand if you've never done any Redux before. Okay. So here's a very simple Redux flow diagram. This is extremely simplified, but that's also why I begin with this, because it's a very, very high-level overview of how data flows in a Redux architecture. The green circles are React components, standard React components. I didn't make this, by the way. It's just a simple diagram. So on the right side, there's no Redux going on here. It's just regular React. This would be called a container. These are presentation components. Pretty much what they teach you on day one of React, right? And then everything on the left side, starting from here to the state, is the Redux architecture. So in Redux, everything revolves around the store or the state. It's sort of synonymous. All the data is in the store. It's all centralized there. And components in a React Redux architecture react to changes in the store. That's kind of how the name React came about. Components react to changes initially in its own internal state, its own state, but Redux took that to a higher level, and now components react to the store. Okay? And then everything revolves around that. So what happens is data has to get transferred to the store, and that happens inside what's called a reducer. A store is really a collection of reducers. So you have 3, 4, 5, 6 reducers, and they all get combined in the store. Okay, and they all get to come together in the store. I myself organize my reducers typically by data type. So if you're creating an application, let's say you're creating a photo sharing app, right? Very conventional photo sharing app, you probably have at least 2 resources, a user and a photo, right? At the very least, you're going to have that. So in my architecture, that would be 2 reducers, a user reducer and a photo reducer, okay? And then they come together in the store. Now, whenever changes happen to data in a store, to a data type, like a user changes his password, a photo is uploaded, like a new photo is added. Maybe you want to change the caption on a photo. Basically, you're changing data for the entire application. That happens through what's called an action. That's what these guys are. Actions are pretty much what they sound like. They're actions. So basically what happens is something happens on a component. This is what the user sees. This is the visual part of the application. Let's say you press a button here, and that adds a caption to a photo. Right? That happens through an action. That then dispatches an action which sends a message to the reducer with what's happening. This user added a caption. This user pressed the like button. This user pressed the downvote button, whatever. Right? The reducer then updates the data according to however you tell it to update. So you set up all these responses based on actions. So maybe you have a response saying, when the user adds a caption, please do the following. Okay, that logic happens in the reducer. Okay, and the reducers to me are like the workhorses of a React Redux architecture. Like that's where all the meat and bones happen. Because it's processing all the data, right? So when the user does something here, presses a button, the upvote button, the downvote button, whatever, that dispatches an action which basically encapsulates the data change, whatever happened to the data. That action then sends a message to the reducer, which will then actually update the data with whatever change you want, upvote, downvote, caption, whatever. And then don't forget the reducer is inside the store, so the store then has been changed, right? And then any component that is connected to the store will then react to that change based on how you assign that connection, okay? So my vocabulary there is a little bit off. Like, it's not that every store component that's connected reacts. It's when you tell it to react based on what data changes. So basically, the connected components decide which reducers it listens to. Okay, so this is a very simplified diagram because typically you have a bunch of reducers and you have like this unit of code right here, page and 3 presentation components. Just multiply that by like 7, like you have another one over here, another one over here. Like that's a more typical React Redux architecture, okay? So that's the data flow. The one thing that's not shown in this diagram that's typically in a React Redux architecture is what's called the constants. Now, actions are delivered with a constant called type. Every action has to have a type. Okay, a type is really just a label, just what kind of action is it. So if there's 2 buttons here, upvote, downvote, right? When I press upvote, that can deliver an action that has a type called photo upvoted, right? Upvote photo, like photo. That's the name of the action, which should be somewhat descriptive of what's happening. It keeps your logic easier to maintain, right? So if there's a downvote one, that should dispatch another action, photo disliked or photo downvoted. Those are called types, which are just raw strings. That's all they are, just strings. Those types are stored in a constants file, and that's not shown in here. But that's typically where they go. Okay, you could just literally put the strings in there, but that's poor form. That's considered anti-best practice. Okay, so the only thing you don't see in this diagram, which is usually in a React Redux architecture, are the constants, which for today, will be the names of the actions. Okay, so that's a very, very quick overview of React Redux. So now let's build one. Actually, I'm going to keep this diagram around so we can refer back to it. Okay, so open up your terminal, cd to wherever you do your work, and let's create a React Redux project. Do not press enter. The Turbo scaffold, it scaffolds 3 types of projects. We're going to use the React flag right now. So this gives you a full React Redux architecture right out of the box. Okay, no backend, just React Redux. So when you press enter, it scaffolds the project. We have to install the dependencies. So cd into the project and do npm install. If you've done Node React stuff before, this should all feel very familiar. It's a typical Node React flow. Okay, so this install will take about 1 to 2 minutes. While it's happening, let's open up the code base so you can get comfortable with the architecture. So here is the code base that's scaffolded out of the box, and all the React Redux code is inside the src directory. Okay, in here you will see the diagram in code form. So we have our actions, our constants, our reducers, our stores, and a generic utility component that doesn't matter for this demo. Like that's not a Redux concept, it's just a utility folder. Okay? So inside those directories are where we set up that data flow. Okay? So if you expand these, you'll just see a bunch of example code. Most of this we're going to strip out. This is example code just for the sake of demonstration, but it's meant to give you a quick template to work off of. Okay? Yeah.
Are you to initialize npm install?
One more, I'm sorry?
To initialize npm install?
Correct. Right here. Just make sure you're in the root directory. Okay? It takes like 2 minutes. That takes a while. So, while it's installing, it's a good time to go through the code and kind of see where all your pieces are. Okay? The actual entry point is going to be the src index file. That's this right here. That's our React entry point. It's already Redux configured. There's a provider component which basically glues your React code to the Redux architecture. And the HTML index is literally the index HTML. This is where our React code is actually mounted onto the root. Okay? So I'm kind of going at a more brisk pace with the understanding that everyone here has a lot of development experience, but if I'm going a little too fast, let me know and I'll backtrack and explain the concepts. Okay? So right now the build is almost done. So once this is done, we'll run the dev server and make sure everything works, and then we'll get started. Okay, so when the build completes, it looks like that. Let me know when you've reached that point. Just give me a thumbs up or something so I know. Okay. And right now we can run the Turbo dev server, which is just a node server, so nothing crazy going on here. And we can go to localhost 3000 to make sure everything worked. Okay, so here's the scaffolded React Redux project out of the box. You should be seeing this, which means everything worked, and then we'll remove all this and get started on our project. Let me turn the server off. Okay, how are we doing so far?
Still installing.
Sorry?
It's still installing.
Okay. The npm installs.
Yes.
Yeah, that takes like 2 minutes. It takes a while because there's a lot of dependencies. So. Okay, so in this project we're going to basically just create a couple users, connect them to the Redux store, and then render those users on a different component. That's basically it. That'll all happen through the Redux architecture. Okay. So if you look at the index.js file in the SRC, you will see that there's an intro component right here, which is being imported from the components/presentation directory right here. And that's where you see the code that we just saw a minute ago. It's all in there, right? So we want to get rid of that and replace it with our code. So we want to put our code in there. Okay, does that make sense? So let's get rid of that. Are you all set? Okay. I don't want to lose anyone. So, and we're going to create our own containers and our own presentation components. I don't think we're going to create a presentation component. We're just going to do it through containers for the sake of time. What am I talking about? So a container component in a Redux situation is any component that's connected to the store. Okay, so we will create at least one container component connected to the store. We'll probably end up creating two, and then all the visual components rendered in the container components should be their own set called presentation components. We're going to bypass that part for the sake of time. Okay, we're just going to put all the visual code inside the containers as well. But that's really, you should make those their own sub-presentation components. Okay, that would be best practice. All right. So get your terminal back up. If you look at the components directory, you'll see that it's organized into containers and presentation. Okay. Yeah, Robert.
Are you staying away from doing layouts?
Yeah, this is just a raw React Redux. So there's a lot of, I'm cutting corners for the sake of concept right now, right? This is certainly not how I'd architect like an actual production scale project for a client. I would use this scaffold, in fact I do, but I would take a lot more time and be more thorough with how I organize my components. Okay, so let's go into our SRC directory and then go into your components directory and then the containers. We have a users container already, so let's reuse this container, but let's take out all the code and start from scratch. Okay, so we're starting from here, and then we're going to render this component inside the actual entry point, the index.html. So let's start by importing the React module itself, component, React class. Okay, the most basic component possible, except for the typo. Spell that right? Component, right? Spell that right. Okay, so I think we can all see what's going on here, right? It's just rendering that div, and that's it. So let's make sure that this is properly rendered when we import it into the entry point. Okay, this index is already exporting users from the scaffold, so we don't have to worry about that. So let's go back to the index.js in here, and let's import that guy. Users from components, containers. And then instead of the intro, let's just get rid of that altogether. Let's render the user's container first. And let's see if that even worked. And then in here, let's run Webpack. All right, Webpack worked. I'm going to run Webpack on a separate tab just so we can watch the file. So we want to open a new tab, Command T, and then Webpack-W, just to keep it running in the background so that when we make changes, we don't have to keep on running Webpack. Okay, so far, pretty standard sort of React setup. And then over back to our original tab, let's run the dev server. Joe, you have a question?
Sorry.
And then let's see how it looks. Okay, great improvement. Okay, so we have obviously a very primitive component set up.
Can
Yep.
you go back for the
Sure.
notification now is when
And then we'll hook this up as a container, we'll hook it up to Redux, we'll set up some actions and do all that noise and then start rendering that in another container. So inside this container, we're going to set up a very simple form with, we'll just go with 2 inputs. We'll go with like a username and a password, and that's it. And then that will create a user, and then which will then just create the sequence I described in the React Redux scenario. It's going to create an action. The action will go to the reducer. The reducer will update the store, and then the container will update with the new data. Okay. And for now, we're going to render inside this list, inside this container, a list of current users. Right? Normally, this would be overkill for Redux because we're only using one container. But once we confirm that the data is properly configured and accurate, we will split it up into 2 containers. That's really how it should be. So to show why we use Redux in the first place, which is a fair question. How are we doing?
can you go to the next index.js to see?
Sure.
Yeah.
You here for the demo, or did you book the room?
For the demo, yeah. I'm sorry, we don't mean to disturb.
Yeah.
Oh, the React Redux demo.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, come on in.
Is that
I thought maybe you booked the room and you were kicking us out.
So we want the webpack and for the webpack, can you go to the next
Oh yeah, yeah. So open up a new tab. Hey Rob, do you think you can catch them up?
Catch them up?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Just- Let me know when you're ready. Okay, so let's set up a couple input fields in here, just username, password, very simple. And then let's make sure that we'll do a username, we'll do a password, and then we'll do a button. For add user. Okay? If your Webpack is running in the background, there's no need to like recompile, it just does it for you. So you can just reload the page and you should see the new contents. Okay? I'm going to get rid of that. This is the user's container. That's not helping us right now. And the styling is very weak right now. It's the inputs are all the way up against the edges. That looks terrible. So let's add a quick padding here. And that'll just give us some sort of wiggle room to work with, right? So. Okay. So again, I'm operating under the impression that you have coding experience. Everyone here has at least a year. So I'm sort of moving at a pace commensurate with that, okay? If at any point I'm just going too fast, say slow down and boost it again. So I'm going to set up some local state right here. So let's do constructor. Let's go with username and password. Okay, so when the user types in values into these input fields, it's going to update the local state reference to the username and password. Okay, so let's hook up those actions, right? Not those actions, those methods right now. So let's create a method called onUser update. And inside these input fields, let's bind it to that method. Standard JavaScript, just on change listeners. I'm not going to get into this conversation, the whole why you have to do this part right here. That's it's a broader JavaScript issue that I just don't want to get into right now. But just that's one way to bind the function to the actual component. There are a couple ways you can do that. I find this to be the most easy to keep track of. All right. So then on here, let's just do a console log. And let's just confirm that this method is properly connected to the inputs, and then we can move on. All right? Everyone good? So one thing you want to get in the habit of doing is checking in on Webpack. Webpack is continually compiling when you make changes, right? So if you make any mistakes, it'll show up right here. And then go back to your terminal. My dev server is still running. The dev server also watches, so you don't have to relaunch the dev server either. Just go ahead and reload the page. Open your developer tools, and then just make sure that you see this when you type into the input fields. Okay, so the listeners were successfully connected. Okay, so we have our data showing up where it should be. Everyone got that? All right.
You go back for the thank you.
Well, we gotta be here anyway. So on the update, we need some way of identifying which input field is giving us the update, so we can know whether to update the username or the password, right? So we can pass in more arguments here. So username, password. And just remember that that argument comes before the event. So field. And then we can just insert that right there, and then we can see, not right there, wrong spot. Okay, so this way we can hopefully see exactly which field is being updated, the username or the password. And then we can make the corresponding update, and that's better than not, right? So checking on Webpack, looks good. It's not complaining, so reload. So you see how it says username right there? So we're covering the right input, and then password, so we're good to go. And then finally, let's actually update the state. So this set state. What's the best way to do this? Let's do if field username. All right, there are probably better ways to do this, but I don't really care at this point. It's just we're updating the values, and that's it. Okay, so we're capturing the values that whoever is typing into it in the state, right? That way, when the user hits the Add User button, we still have those values stored, right? They didn't just go away, hopefully. So we're about to confirm that. So everyone with me so far? Okay, so let's create a method for the button. So add user. And then let's just bind the method, so on click. Just make sure you catch that. And then that's on click, it's just not on change, so be careful about that distinction. And then here we'll just do a console log just to make sure. So add user. Okay, so let's see if that worked. Okay, it's hard to see. The type is really small, but do you see on the bottom, got the username, password? Good. So we have our values. Everything's good to go.
Can you go back
Yep.
for the on-chain event? After for the one okay.
I'm going to get rid of these console logs since we've confirmed that they worked, so I'm just going to get rid of those. Okay. How are we doing so far? Good? Trenton, you good? Joe? Okay, let's create a user object. So const user. Normally there'd be some like validation here, like make sure the username has at least 3 characters or something like that. Make sure the password, doesn't contain like certain characters, whatever. So obviously in a more realistic project, you want to be considerate of that. I'm just sort of cutting corners for convenience. So just make sure you understand that. So let's do one more console log right here. And let's stringify the user. Test. Cool. So now there's our user, in JSON, in just actual JSON. So we're good to go. And now we want to take that data and create our first action. We want to send that data to the Redux environment via an action, right? That's what I was saying earlier with the chart. So now right here, we are now right here in the diagram, right? Right here. So when I hit a button, right, what's going to happen? We're going to actually post the user. We're going to send it via an action to the reducer, okay? So we have to hook up those mechanisms, right? Literally connect them, okay? So right now, this component, it's not really a container because we didn't connect it to Redux, right? It's just a glorified presentation component right now. That's not good enough. So the first thing we got to do is connect this guy to Redux. And that literally happens through a function called connect. So we do connect from the React Redux library. Okay, we're also going to import the actions because we need to create an action, right? If you think about the diagram, where are we next? We're about to create an action. So we have to import the actions from the action directory. So where are we? Containers. So that's 2 levels up. Actions. Okay. So now let's go ahead and actually create that connection. So before I move, everyone have this? Okay. So we scroll to the bottom. Okay. And above the export, we create a new function called state2props. And then we create another one called dispatch to props. Okay, we'll leave these empty for now, but let's actually create the connection. Okay. So then down here, we actually invoke the connect method, connect, with the arguments state2props and dispatch to props. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff going on here we need to cover. So Matt, can you toss me a marker? Thanks. So right here, the state2props function is probably the most important function in Redux, probably. This is literally the function that connects the store to your components via a property. It takes the data in your store and applies them to the container as properties. Okay, that's why it's called state2props. The naming is very descriptive, right? It helps keep things straight. The dispatch to props basically invokes the same thing for the actions. So it takes the actions and it applies them to this component as a property. Okay, so this component will be assigned properties by virtue of these 2 functions. And the connect function right here carries that out. It does it. So the connect function is pretty important because it actually forges that connection. So now this is a container component. It doesn't like listen for anything yet, but it is officially a container component. It's connected to the Redux store. So if we go back to our terminal, we're just making sure Webpack doesn't complain. By the way, the reason I always check in on Webpack is because if I make a mistake, it shows up here. So let me show you an example. Very typical mistake I would make is something like this. I would do this pretty much twice a day. And then look at what happens on Webpack. Right? Webpack is saying that's not going to work. The build failed. Okay? Very, very typical mistake. We all make these mistakes, but you have to check in on Webpack to make sure. Okay? So go back here, put the comma back, and then the build should resume. And now it came back. Okay? So this right here in the state to props is a reference to the Redux store. This is where we can decide which reducers we care about. That's why I said not all containers react, only the ones that you care about, the ones that you assign, which right now are none. Right? So if we go to the store right here, right, you will see that we have one reducer, line 3. Line 3, right? And then that's reducer is assigned right here on line 10. Now normally this is where you would have a bunch of reducers, right? So this would be like 10 lines long, 7 lines long, whatever, right? But we only have one reducer for now, and it'll probably stay that way. But we have our one reducer, which is right here, and it's assigned as a property called user. This is the key that matters, user, okay? So if we go back to the container, we can reference that user key. So user equals state.user. Okay, so right here on line 61 where it says state.user, you guys see that? That is a direct reference to that property right there, i.e. the user reducer. That connection is very important to understand. Okay, so now this container is connected to the user reducer. All right, so if I go to the user reducer in the reducers directory, you'll see we already have a bunch of scaffolded code. We're going to remove just about all of this because we want to build this up from the bottom. So let's get rid of all this stuff. Here is our user reducer with nothing in it. Okay, this is the most basic reducer. This is a reducer that does nothing. Okay, so at a bare minimum, you have to have this. Okay. Now remember when I said earlier the reducers listen for actions. It listens. It's basically on standby, saying, "Hey, whenever you got something new, let me know." Okay. So that happens through an action, right? And those actions have names, which we call types, right? And the reducer listens for action types. That's how it determines what to do. Okay, so I'm kind of slowing down here because this is like where the real work happens. This is where the business logic takes place. Not like all of it, but this is where the magic happens. So here we have a switch statement based on the action type. Right, so when you dispatch an action, there's only one rule. It has to have a type. You can add anything else on top of that. You can add as much data as you want, but at the bare minimum, you have to have a type. So then here we have a type. And we set up a switch statement. And when I press that button, what's about to happen? We're about to create a user. So here we have an action type called user created, or you can call it create user or whatever you want to call it, but that's the name of the action. Okay? And this, you may notice on line 13, this is coming from the constants. So we have to define that constant in the constants file. But for now, all we're going to do is a console log. We'll leave it at that for now. Okay? If you go to the constants file, where is it? Right here. You'll see that the user created constant is already assigned by that string. Constants are just strings and that's it. Okay? I'm going to remove the other stuff for the sake of simplicity. Okay, so we're going to strip this down to just what we need. Okay? So that's the user created constant. Good? Now remember, this is delivered via an action. So we have to open the actions file and create the corresponding action to invoke this. Right? So we open the actions file, which has a bunch of stuff which we're going to remove. Okay? And then we're going to create our actions from scratch. So create user. So this is literally the action that will dispatch to the reducer. So remember what I said earlier, actions must have one property. What is it? Type. That's the only thing it has to have. So we have to give it a type. We only have one type, right? What is it? User created? User created. But remember, on top of that, you can add as much more stuff on top that you want. So if I had an action with only a type, it's pretty useless, right? Like what data changed, right? So here we want to add the user as the data payload. Okay, so I'm adding another piece of data to this action called data, and I'm going to pass in the user as the data payload. That will also go to the reducer. Okay, so actions are just transport vessels. It just transports data from the containers and the components to the reducer, and that's all it does. They're like messengers of data. Okay? Let's go back to the reducer briefly. And remember, I just added a new key to the action called data, so we can now console log that as well. All right. We made a fair number of changes. It's definitely a good idea to check in on Webpack because it's very possible I made a mistake. I still may have made a mistake, but at least it wasn't a build error. So it's going to be a runtime error, which are even more fun to find. How are we doing so far? Is everyone's code compiling? Everyone's build clean? Good. So now we go back to the user's container. Now it's time to dispatch that action. Okay, now it's time to actually call it. So we go back to the container, and down here, dispatch to props, that's where we run the actions. So here, remember what I said, this function, dispatch to props, does what this guy does, state to props, for actions. It assigns actions as properties to the component. So we want to create a new action here called create user. Which is simply a sort of a proxy for the action create user method. Okay? But we dispatch it. We call it. Okay? That's what we called it, right? Create user? Yes. Okay. Because when I make mistakes, it's usually stuff like this. Like I might call it user created, like something like that is where I typically make my mistakes. So now remember what I said. This guy assigns actions as properties on the component. So the component now has a new property called create user, and that property is a function, a method. Okay? So, which takes a user argument, just the raw JSON of the user. That's just all that is. Okay? So, where do we create a user? Right here. That action is going to be dispatched right here. Okay? So here, remember, it's a property. So this dot props add user, and then we pass in the user payload from the state. Now, if we did our job right, this should dispatch the action, go to the reducer. The reducer will update the store, which will trigger a re-render of this component. That's what's supposed to happen. Okay? So we should see this console log and another one. Who remembers the other one? Where would I find it? In the reducer, exactly. Right here. I should see 2 console logs. That's why I left this one behind, to confirm that the reducer is successfully connected. Whenever I do make a mistake, it's usually right there. Okay? So let's go ahead and test it out. First of all, check in on Webpack, because nothing happens if Webpack isn't happy. Webpack looks good. User 1, password, add user 1, 2. Okay, so that's the reducer. Now we're in business. Okay, everyone got that? Good. So this guy right here should have triggered a re-render. Let's do one more test. Let's go back to users container and do a console log in the render. So we see it right here because it just loaded. So obviously a render happens, right? And then if I do adding a user, oh, I'm getting re-renders here. Can anyone guess why? Setting the state. Every time you set the state, the component reloads, right? So we covered that. Let's get rid of all that nonsense though. Here we go. And then here, that's the most important one, okay? This render right here happens why? Anyone? Because the store changed, the state data changed. So if we did not see this render, all bets are off. Something's wrong. But we do, so we're good to go. So everyone with me? So now, let's take this user in the reducer. That's our new user right there. Let's take that user and add it to the list of all. Let's add that user to the list. So let all equals object. So here, we're creating a new array referenced for all. We're creating a new copy. This is sort of a rule of React and Redux. You don't change state. You don't really actually ever change state. You reassign state. You just make new copies and reassign it. That's what we're doing here. And then we're adding the new user right here to the array, just a normal array push, nothing unusual there. And then we take the new state, assign the all variable to the new one, and then we return the new state, which was there the whole time, so that's fine. Okay, so again, I'm kind of glossing over things pretty fast just based on what you guys told me in terms of how much experience you have development-wise. Okay, how are we doing so far? Good. Check your Webpack, make sure there's no crashing. All right. So now here, this is the business logic. Now our data is now updated corresponding to an action dispatched, right? Corresponding to an event on the UI, right? So now we can go back to the user's container. If we scroll to the bottom, you may remember the state to props is the first one we connected. That assigns a property to the component from the store. In this case, the user reducer, right? So it has another new property called this.props.user, which is a direct reference to the user reducer. So what we can do is we can create an array right here. Let's go down here. Current users. I'm just going to throw in some static HTML just to see how it looks first, or JSX, whatever you want to call it. And then, all right, looks good to me. They're going to show up down there. So I think we can do a little bit better than that. I just can't stand it when it looks really terrible. You don't have to do this. This is just me being nitpicky with the UI. So like you see how the left margins aren't aligned and there's a huge padding between current users and all that stuff. I'm just like getting rid of all that nonsense. It just looks a little bit more coherent. That's all. Okay. So now let's render these users from the reducer, right? From the actual store. That's the whole purpose of this, right? So here, again, remember what I said, there's a property on the component now assigned by state to props. It's called the user by virtue of that variable right there on line 71. So this.props.user, which is a direct reference to the reducer has a property called all, which starts out as an empty array. Okay? So dot all, and then we can map through that. The user has a username and a password property. Obviously, we don't want to render the password. When you iterate through arrays in React, you have to assign a key property for each level of the iteration. It's a React rule. It doesn't pertain to this situation, but you still have to have it. This pertains to what's called server-side rendering. It's how React identifies what components from the server are supposed to match up with the components from the client-side render. Okay, everyone got that? And then we check in on Webpack again. Dev server still running. Good, nothing crashed, which is good. So then we can do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And there's our first user from the Redux store. Did everyone get that? Yep.
The very last step before it renders on the screen is the reducer, right?
Very last step before. Yes, correct. And then the re-render.
Right, so all the data, at the very end, it's all sitting in the reducer and sort of just waiting for you to call it on the front end to render.
All the way around. The reducer triggers the re-render. So the reducer, or i.e. the store, dictates when the render happens. So it's more like the component is sitting on standby, waiting for the store to change, and then it'll re-render. That's called the one-way data flow. So right here, this is a little bit more than we actually have. Imagine these guys aren't here. We only have that one component. This guy is just waiting. It's always on standby. And whenever this guy changes, the store, that will re-render with whatever new data there is.
Yes, so, but the reducer is the last, where the last change happens.
Yes,
Okay.
and then, exactly. And then the store says, oh, I'm sorry, the component says, well, there's a change, let's reload. That's it. And it's always like, think of this as in a clockwise circular data flow. Data should never go from here to here. No, 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 no. It always goes like that. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, do you guys come from an Angular background? Or what's your front-end coding that you do?
I would say beginner of both Angular and React.
Okay, so Angular and React do not jive the same way from a data standpoint. So like I did a lot of Angular for the past, I stopped about a year ago, but I did Angular professionally for about 2 years. Right? Angular, it's very much MVC. So you're very used to having it's called the two-way data binding, right? So in Angular, you have your presentation layers updating the state, essentially, the data. That's a big no-no in React. In React, it always goes through this dispatch cycle. Okay, so it's always a clockwise cycle. This never goes there. So, all right, everyone got this working? Let me just change this. This UI really sucks. I just can't stand it. Font size. All right, I can live with that. It's a little bit better. All right, so now, up till now, using Redux here is completely pointless. Can anyone identify why?
It's not really in any other component.
Right, exactly. We only have one component. So we could have done this entire thing in state. We could have put all that add user stuff over here. It would have worked just fine. And in fact, that's what I would recommend you do unless you don't have the option. In other words, don't use Redux for everything. Don't even use React for everything. Use the tools where they're meant to be used. This is the single biggest mistake I see junior developers make. To every hammer, every problem looks like a nail, right? So they're using React, and Rob, this is what happened in your, not that you did it, but the other people did it, in your OneSignal or Signal, OpenSignal. Yeah, open whatever. There were a bunch of junior devs on his project that he walked into that was over-optimized for React. Too much React going on. That's overreacting, essentially. And so here, this would be a case of over-reduxing, right? That being said, I think we have enough experience in this room. I'd like you to try the following. I'd like you to try to create another component, a container component, called current users. And I want those current users to render from here. I don't want this in here. I want to get rid of that. And I want these to show up in another component entirely called current users. Okay? So try that right now. This is like an exercise. Like, try it right now. And then if you need help, I'll help you. So. All right, so what did I say? A container component, right? So we want components. User container, current users is what I said, right? Current users. Okay. I call the current user. Damn it. I hate when I do that. Okay, I always forget to do this part, so now I always do this first. I just run the export right away. Right. Okay. Now, if you're a beginner, I wouldn't normally recommend this, but I'm going to cheat a little bit and just copy and paste from the users container and just strip everything out that I don't need. In my more long-form classes where I'm teaching complete beginners, I would not do this, but that's not what this is, so let's just save some time on this. So I'm going to remove everything here but the current user's array. Right? Now the reason I did it this way is because this component is already connected. I just copied and pasted it over, right? So just don't forget to change the names and stuff. Good. And then go back to your users component and remove that list like so. Now when I reload the app, okay, I'm going to lose all my UI, right? Because I just removed the current users list. So when I do this, nothing will show up. However, the data is still there, right? So the only thing left to do is render the current users component. That's it. So we just grab that from, where am I doing the overall render? That's happening in the index, right? Yeah. So we just grab that new component and just throw it on there. It's already connected. The data connection's already been taken care of. It's basically the same container in a different visual configuration. So now when I reload, and watch it crash. Let's see. Thank you. And back in business, so we just do that and then that. Now we have our two containers rendering the data from the same data source. Okay? And then if I add another one, it should, what did I just do? Let me just do another one real quick. And then, okay. Now, I'm going to go back to my current user's container. I'm going to remove that red color font. You probably didn't do it in the first place. That's fine. Right? So here, all the users will show up in the normal, like, sort of dark gray color. Right? Now, what if I want to add, I'm going to just start using real names here. Okay, now what if I want to add clickability on those usernames such that when I click on a username, the selected one highlights as red? If I want to do that, I want to go to my current user's container, right? That's where all those usernames are rendered. Should I route that through Redux? Do I need to create an action and then a corresponding sequence in the reducer to create that visual effect?
To highlight that?
Yes. Why not?
Imagine what
Or why would I want to do, like, I could put it through Redux, right?
you could, yeah.
Why wouldn't I?
The rest of the application doesn't need to know about
Exactly, right.
Right.
This is the only component that cares about the selected user, right? Now, if I run everything through Redux, that's not like a bad thing. It's not going to break. But what am I doing? It's overcomplicating too much, right? You have to understand when to use what tool. So again, one of the biggest mistakes that I see junior devs, I'm guilty of this too when I was junior. Like everyone, this is part of the sort of maturation process. One of the biggest things I see is overusage of these tools and frameworks. You have to know when to use them and when not to use them. So if you go on my website, here, am I using React Redux? Don't look at the source code, just guess. Why not? Why not?
So I didn't get the question.
The state summary changes often, right?
Hardly ever.
Yeah.
It's just, this is basically a glorified picture, right? The state like practically never changes. Using Redux here is overkill, right? So I have another, this is not my website, this is another startup I came across. Would you use React Redux here?
Maybe.
Based on
No.
what? Why not?
Well, because it's all really happening in the front end, all the changing.
What state do you think would change on this?
If you were to click somewhere,
How do I get rid of this thing?
they change. They
You're on a timer.
Okay. Even if there were click handlers, like enter your email, subscribe to our newsletter, right? I mean, do we need React Redux for that?
I don't think you need it for that.
Yeah, this is overkill, right? So this one is using React Redux. Furthermore, this is server-side rendered, right? Now look, here's the React Redux root. This is at a point where React Redux is actively hurting them because, well, who can guess why? Why is React Redux a step backwards here? A couple reasons. There's no like single right answer here, but can anyone see some drawbacks as to why React Redux is too much here? A lot more work. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. And then they hooked up server-side rendering. These components are server-side rendering, server-side rendered, right? Meaning they're rendered from the back end. But do you see all the HTML code here that you would have expected to see? I mean, this is a pretty in-depth, a lot of stuff going on, right? But all that code is not showing up here. It would all be jammed in right here. This should be normally like several screens long, but it's not showing up here, meaning all this data right here is client-side rendered, like an Angular 1 application. Why is that bad in this case? It's more of a business rule. It's bad because you're losing all of the SEO benefits. So now here, in this situation, React Redux is actively hurting the business. Right? It defeated the purpose. Furthermore, if I want to hire a junior dev to work on this because I want to change the font sizes and the font colors, very simple. Well, who do I have to find? A React Redux developer who knows server-side rendering. Good luck.
Right.
Good luck. That's me. And you're going to pay me a lot of money to change these font colors. Because I don't care how easy you think it is, I still got to learn your stack. So that's a bad business decision, right? Because changing this font color, I can hire a college kid at $15 an hour. Say, just take 5 hours. I don't care. Like just get it done, right? You see the distinction here? So you have to know when to use what. And a big part of the reason I get the contracts I get is because I can articulate those decisions clearly to a business person. And that brings home the contract work for me. Because they understand that I understand the business nature of the situation rather than just jamming in the most sophisticated framework wherever I can. Okay? So if you're going into contracting like me, if your goal is to become a freelance engineer like I am, these are the things that you have to be aware of and be able to articulate and then close deals. That's how I close deals, because most of my discussions are with business people. And I have to have sound business decisions within the context of coding. Okay? Anyway, this isn't a business lecture, it's a React Redux lecture. So everyone got this working?
My problem was I flagged the div on the users and current users. So you're just telling me that.
Oh, that's what, Trenton was talking about that, yeah.
That was the only issue.
I forgot to, so.
Yeah, it's like home.
So.
It doesn't fix that so particularly.
Okay, well, we got through just about everything I wanted to. Before I shut the video down and all that, any questions, anything else you want to see real quick while we're still recording? Yep.
How about I'm not getting it like the way it should be. I don't know where the mistake is really is.
Oh, I'll take a look at it afterward. That's fine. Anything else you want to clarify?
Just a question about constants.
Yeah.
like declaring them instead of inside of your reducer in the switch statement, like instead of just putting in the string.
I've seen people
what's
just
the-
put in the raw strings.
Yeah, is there like a benefit of doing the constants? Like,
Yeah, so for me, I like using the constant file because sometimes I change my mind on the name of a constant, the actual raw string version. So you may have noticed we use the constants in 3 separate files. If I have to then keep track of all those files if I want to make one change. Little things like that. So yeah, if I had strings all over the place, then I'd have to go to all the files and change them. So that's basically it. But sometimes I change the actual constant itself. So that means I gotta just do it anyway. Like it doesn't save anything. But a lot of this is also just convention. Like I've studied so many repos. This is what I've seen. I just follow the convention. So is your hand up?
Yep, I have a question. If you go back to the users container. Okay, can you go back to like add user on user update? That's one of the functions. Okay. Is there a benefit of using, I say you didn't use arrow functions there. Is there a benefit of not using that there?
Oh no, I've seen it both ways.
So you don't have to do the bind this on the.
Yeah, it's either. I've seen it both ways. I wouldn't say one is like best practice over the other.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering.
Anything else?
Is there like a best practice for implementing pagination using Redux?
I would custom implement it. So I would basically my APIs would have a limit parameter. I'll just show you an example. So in Turbo, I have a profile API endpoint. I have 1,000 something users on the back end, right? So I don't want to load all of them into a component. That's silly. So, like this is okay, almost 1070. So if I loaded all these into a component, you'll start to see some bugginess. Like you will notice that. So you want to do like the limit 100, and then that's only 100. So this is more of an API question, right? So now it's only 100, and then on my component architecture, I would add that limit parameter, and then that would be my page. Page 1 is 0 through 99. Page 2 is 100 through 199, etc., etc. That's how I would paginate. What I would advise against doing, this is also a very sort of beginner impulse, is to look for like a pagination library. Look up an NPM module for pagination. You don't want to like overload your NPMs like for stuff that you should be able to handle, right? So a very beginner impulse is to look for NPMs and dependencies and libraries for like everything. If you do that, you're not learning. And for something simple like a pagination thing, like you should custom implement that. It shouldn't really take too much time. I'll show you one quick example where I'm doing exactly that. So here, if I go back on Turbo, because Turbo is where I do all my work now. So if I go back on Turbo, so here's my recent activity feed that I hammered this in a couple days ago. And this, right now, this is up to probably around 300. But I'm only loading 100 at a time using that limit parameter. I didn't paginate, though, just because I got lazy. But like I could just do page 1, page 2, page 3, or like next page, whatever. Or like an infinite scroll or whatever. So, anything else? Good. All right. So let me just shut the video down.